Nice to see all of y'all. I'm excited to chat today. I am not planning on doing most of the talking for sure during this. So like I wrote this blog post a couple of weeks ago. It got published on this idea of lean data science. This is an idea that I've like sort of been kicking around, but I never really like put words behind, about this idea of trying to figure out how to make data scientists more efficient. Especially like, I think that if you read enough Medium posts, you'll see a lot of people sort of complaining about data scientists spending a lot of time in the ivory tower, doing a lot of like modeling, but not having business impact. And so this is a thing that like I care a lot about and think a lot about, and took this like first stab at trying to put words behind it, thinking about like, okay, what does it actually mean to like, how can we help our data scientists be more effective, generate more value for the business, without having them just be like sort of off in modeling land in a way where they're not actually like driving a lot of value. And so I work as an entrepreneur, and I sort of have spent most of my time working in startups where we think a lot about this idea of validated learning, about sort of trying experiments, putting them out in the world in the cheapest way possible, this idea of minimum viable product, MVP, measuring it, seeing if it worked. If it did, sort of like continuing on that path and trying to get value out of it. And if not, like sort of ditching it and moving on to the next thing. And so when I think about running a data science team, that's sort of like the methodology that I think about using, partly just because of my background and like this experience working in startups. But also I just think it's like a good model for working when you're working in areas that have a lot of, uncertainty. But that's sort of like what that post was about. And I'm really curious to hear from other people in the community about how they think about it, whether or not they recognize this as a problem, whether they have different approaches to thinking about how to get value out of data science. On the thread in the where I posted the link originally in Slack, this guy Vijay, who I think he works at Rent the Runway, he had some really interesting points about sort of like contra what I was saying, which is that like you really need to actually invest in this dedicated infrastructure. You need to sort of burn the ships behind you and like really commit to working on these projects if they're going to be high value. Otherwise, you're going to be flailing, which I think was a really good point and was not a thing that I had been thinking a lot about. So I'm really curious to hear from all of y'all, other people in the community, like what your experience has been, if any of that post resonated with you or didn't. I'd love to hear about it. Instead of going through and doing like introductions, which can sort of be a long time when we have this many people on the call, if you do want to add something, maybe just like say your name and like, where you work or something, just to give us a little bit of context when you're jumping in. I'm Michael, I'm an entrepreneur, and I do some stuff with Locally Optimistic. Nice to meet all of you.
And I endorse this message.
Thank you, Trevor.
Just, it sounded like the political ad. I'm Michael and I endorse this message. Now that I butted in, I think I'll give it a shot. Hi, my name's Trevor. I brought along a couple friends here today. I work at Panoply. You may or may not have opinions about Panoply depending on the size of your company or your thoughts about data warehousing in general. But I work on growth there, which to me is very much what you kind of mentioned, lean application of data. So just making the maximum impact out of the kind of fuzziest amount of data that you may or may not have to work with. And what I think there was a couple parts of the article to me that I'm very much application oriented rather than kind of like philosophical about it. And I like the notion of, just putting the scrappy model in JS. It sounded like terribly hacky, but that's where like the part of the article that was most interesting to me was mostly about application and also kind of success criteria. And so I'm not somebody who's ever led a data science team or really done a whole lot of modeling and putting things back into the application. But first question I had to you and maybe the broader group was, how does the success criteria for a data analyst or somebody who works a lot with data differ from somebody who's doing kind of data science and applying data models into an application? And are those the same? Should they be different?
I can take a first stab at answering this. I think I know that there are other people in this group who will have sort of differing opinions on this. So I think about them as being like fairly to very different. I think about data analysts as being a lot more sort of responsive to one-off or individual business needs or requests. So it's like you've got a marketer and they're trying to figure out like what were the results of this A/B test that we ran. That's something that they might coordinate with an analyst on. And so, I think about analysts as sort of, they need to have a lot of business context, they need to be really smart, they need to be able to communicate really well. But they're sort of doing a little bit more of that, like interacting directly with the business and being very responsive to those shifting business needs. When I think about data scientists, I'm thinking about sort of longer timescale projects, doing things that are a little bit more infrastructure-y. They're less likely to get an email from the CEO, like asking them to go look into a thing, and are more sort of working like software engineers, particularly with a product manager, and sort of trying to have an impact on the business that way. So I think about data scientists as being more like software engineers, where you evaluate their work from like a technical perspective, and then how well that like actually impacts the business. So the same way you might judge a product team on, user engagement with their new feature or whatever, you would sort of think about a data science team that way, which is fairly different than how I think about evaluating an analyst performance, which is a little bit more on sort of like how well they work with the business stakeholders to whom, like, who are their sort of partners in the business. I don't know. I'm curious to hear what other people think on that.
Yeah, we have notions of both. I'm Katie. I'm a data science manager at Reddit. We have both types of roles at our company, although we call them both data science. But one of them, like the way that I usually end up explaining it internally, is that the role that we would call analytics is more product aligned and more business impact aligned. And the role that we would call modeling, or maybe data science in other companies, is a lot more engineering aligned. The way you described it is actually pretty similar to how we think about it, where people who focus on modeling, it's usually like they're prototyping or actually creating a model that is then shipped by someone else. And the impact of that model is generally how the success of the project is determined. Although there are some models that are done like purely for an analytics purpose, like a forecasting model. But in general, I would say the analytics workflow is the one that is much harder to actually have acceptance criteria for. And I've tried many versions of this over time. The one that I find to be the most helpful is like a set check-in, actually. Usually it's like we agree upon like what is the highest priority question that we have to answer based on whether someone has worked with that data before or knows anything about the area. We give a general estimate of how much time we think we need to explore it. And then we have some agreed upon checkpoint of this is what we found. Is this enough for what we're trying to do? And if it is, that's that. If it's not, then we iterate to another step, set up another checkpoint. And that's been our most successful way of thinking about acceptance criteria for analytics style work. I do think it's predicated on having a decent data platform, though.
So I think, that's interesting, because my take on data analysts, like last time I joined one of these things, Katie, you had to mention, I think, something about giving people some liberty and some free time to just explore and find something that has high leverage. And that way, I kind of feel like maybe analysts don't get enough action to trying to create their own leverage. Because like what you mentioned about how the model has some effects on product metrics. The model seems like a product in itself, very easy to measure the performance of it. But then I guess to me, it just depends on and I'm sorry to pull this away from data science, but more to analytics, but the leverage I guess depends on the role of the analyst, whether it's trying to create leverage or just be a question answer. And then like their measurement is like a tertiary thing to, did you ask the right question? Did you get the right information? And then did that answered question have impact on the business? So
what makes you say it's tertiary?
Well, in that, like, yeah, because like if somebody asks a good question, you say, well, this is the three top ways to approach that. And then they take that information, put it into action, then you measure the results. So that's that kind of 3-step part to it. But yeah, so I guess yeah, to me, it just seems like it's a little bit easier to measure the outcomes of a data science kind of work. But it's, I guess, very different. So thanks for answering that question. I should have just kept that inside of my head so you guys don't have to hear through my entire kind of thinking bar there.
I think you're right, though. Measuring the impact of analytics work is way harder because it is like a second or third order effect. It's usually realized through someone else.
I've seen pop up in Locally Optimistic a bunch. People, like, I feel like it's every few months someone will chime in with the like, hey, the CEO or CFO asked me how to measure the ROI of our data team. And I feel like I was seeing this a bunch. I actually wrote a blog post about it a couple months ago. And Michael was kind enough to give me some feedback on it, actually. And the thing I kind of explored a little bit was like, if you as the analytics team or you as the analyst are trying to justify like the ROI of like a investigation you made, it's going to be really hard. Like there's some models you build and deploy that have like a financial impact you can point to, like your conversion rate went up this much because and like that's great. But a lot of the stuff, especially if we're picking on this like analyst dichotomy, it's like at a previous job, the data team spent time actually trying to quantify the impact of like each like investigation they did. And I didn't feel like it was a good use of time at all. And the thing I kind of congealed for me was like, in talking to a bunch of people, was that the ROI story for a data team really comes down to the business saying like, these guys are great. Like I'm getting a lot of leverage out of them. And again, at this previous company, there was a phase for our data team where folks like myself on ops were looking at like, I don't know what, I'm not getting a lot out of the data team right now. It's kind of R&D, versus a phase where they were actually really tied and they shared our OKRs. And we were really bound at the hip and like success was shared. And so it's funny when people bring up like measuring impact or like ROI for data, I kind of cringe a little bit because I'm like, I don't know, for most things data teams do, or a lot of things I've certainly done in the past, it's really hard to do. And it may not be as valuable as even just like the head of marketing saying like, yeah, the data team's done a lot for us, and like pointing to the projects that were enabled by them and like looking at the ROI of those projects versus like this notebook someone put together. Also, I forgot to introduce myself. Hi, I'm Barry. I'm run a data tool company, but before that, I've been building data software for a long time, and I've been on data teams and just worked with 1 million data teams over time.
And I'd love to hop in on that. So I'm Nate. I'm a senior data analyst at Smartsheet. So I've been in analytics for 5-6 years now. I made a conscious decision, I remember, between do I want to be a data analyst or data scientist, and figure that out. That's an interesting part of kind of what lane do you want to be in as a data worker. In terms of measuring impact, I couldn't agree more that the ticket taking side of things, I really find to be the least value as an analyst. Like if you're just kind of ticket taking, that's kind of a junior kind of role. In terms of measuring impact, I always try to find a pretty, like a SVP or higher level kind of stakeholder that really can run things for me and can speak to, you're talking about the head of marketing, that can really speak to the value of a project. And I try to find, if we get lots of tickets in, I try to identify, is there something a lot of people are spending an hour or two on per week, and can I automate that? That's, as a data analyst, I think I drive business value is, sometimes I do things you can tie money to, but really it's time savings. Like I found a bunch of analysts are spending time pulling data into Excel or Smartsheet, about an hour or two a week across 250 people. And so it was really easy for me to then to take what I could do in Snowflake and just automate that and just update it every day for them automatically. And that saved everyone about an hour a week or so. And that kind of stuff, if you find enough of those little projects, I think that's where people say like they're saving us time, we're finding data faster, it's more accurate. People can take action on data in a better way, that kind of thing.
I think I'd be skeptical if, it's possible, but I'd be skeptical if someone came to you and was like, hey, estimate the ROI for that, of like trying to sum up everyone's hours and putting like a dollar value on it. Like I would guess that the people who have benefited from that were probably just raving about it and would like have advocated for the efficacy of the data team without like a price tag on it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you're right.
I'm curious for everyone, do you have data analysts or scientists that are specifically partnered with like maybe a marketing group or a product group? Like the getting your partners to advocate for your ROI, I think is very natural when that's your structure. And I'm curious how people have their team structured and whether they feel like that's a path forward for them. I can answer first, I guess. So my team tends to have people who are specifically partnered with a product group. And we actually do have product request headcount on our behalf. And that, like, when they don't have data support for whatever reason, maybe someone's on vacation or someone like makes an internal transfer, we usually hear about it in terms of like, we're at such a disadvantage because we don't have our data people. So having a strong partnership has actually helped create a situation where we have other people advocating for the ROI of data, which is a really good position to be in because it saves me a lot of trouble of being annoying.
Yeah, I think there's like a current, I wouldn't call it a flame war, but there's a current thread in Locally Optimistic in one of the channels about data team orgs. And there's like the titular, like, what's your title and where do you sit in the org chart? The thing that I thought was cool that I've talked to a few people who've done is no matter how the team's organized, it's having people that are more embedded, but then sharing OKRs or however you're setting goals. And knowing like the data team basically looking and like saying like, yeah, like all of our OKRs are driven, besides like some core infrastructure ones, like all of our OKRs are driven by like these things that are important to the business. And I just think that as like your metric of success pervades like how you're going to spend your day and engage. And yeah, I know, Katie, it sounds like you kind of have the ideal situation of like,
I wouldn't go that far.
Well, but a good situation where like when it, you know, when software breaks and people complain about it, in some ways, like it's a good thing because like you know that it was valuable. It's like when your data team's not there and people complain about it, that's good.
Yeah,
like
they feel the pain of not having us at least.
Do people in here actually have, so Katie obviously does have, it sounds like she has data scientists or people who are working sort of more on this like software engineering modeling. Are other people in here like actively working with data scientists right now? Or is that like less a part of your team and more focused on doing analytics, or sort of like more sort of traditional analytics and BI type work?
I do technically have both, but
my team, there's just two of us, and I am not a data scientist. I have been like more of an analyst in my career, but he comes from a data science background. But I would say that we're still doing more analytics, BI work. So making sure that people can self-service, and we're just now reaching the point where we're starting to answer more complicated problems and considering using more sophisticated methods. But we keep finding ourselves in the position of using this, I guess, quote unquote, lean data science approach where we're getting 90% of the value with doing just 10% of the work, like investing 10% of the resources. So yeah, we are definitely applying this methodology.
So how do you like structure that? Or is it like, who is like product managing, I guess, like this process? Is it you who's like coming up with these ideas and writing the stories, or like, how do you actually do that?
Yeah, I mean, we do, you know, spikes. So I guess we always start with the problem statement of, you know, what is the goal? What is the output? What's the acceptance criteria in terms of what do we want to see happen for either the customer or for the business stakeholder? And then do a little bit of a 2-hour, 4-hour investigation on like what approaches we could take, weighing pros and cons. And then we do kind of find ourselves always choosing the, I guess, lean data science approach. I think like a good example for us was trying to help the CX team with their staffing model. And so we could use like a time series or a regression analysis to try and predict how many tickets we're going to get every month for the next year, or we could just use a simple incident rate. So based on the number of orders, what percent of tickets, what percent of orders do we think are going to result in a ticket? And that's like 1/20th the amount of work, and it gets us 90% of the way there. So, I mean, I think, you know, I think for some people who are, you know, they're in data science for a reason, they're excited to use shiny tools and algorithms. And so like, for that to be just good enough is kind of maybe disappointing, but at the end of the day, it's what they needed in terms of business value. So we can move on and start tackling the next highest priority project.
yeah, that's actually a good point, that maybe one of the things that makes this workflow lean is getting people to use the simple solution instead of the complex one, because people think they want the complex one. They want to be able to say that we have this advanced AI, whatever, but a lot of AI is actually just a pivot table secretly.
We got a lot of case statements.
So I'm curious, like, what do y'all think about, like, how do you think about like motivating data scientists in this world? So this is like another interesting question, right? It's like, if we're going to be lean and we're going to be doing a lot of stuff that like is like hacky science instead of like, you know, whatever deep learning, like, you know, if you hire a data scientist who wants to like do some real stuff and you're like, no, it's like everything's a pivot table. Sorry, buddy. Like, how do you think about, like, I don't know, especially you, Katie, because I know you have experience with this. Caitlin, I think you have experience with this as well. Like, I'm curious how y'all think about that.
Yeah, I had just unmuted myself to say, like, actually, when I talk to analytics leaders, this is like really not controversial. When you talk to relatively junior data scientists, that's where it's controversial because they think the job is something different than it is. And also sometimes when you talk to stakeholders who are like, but no, like, throw some machine learning at the problem. Surely that's better than like you telling me that we get 0.1 tickets per order. Surely that's smarter. But yeah, you know, I think part of it is not hiring data scientists before you're ready. Like, if all you're doing is pivot tables, then don't hire someone who really wants to do machine learning, and make sure that sort of expectations are aligned early on and that you're setting up the role to be a growth role for whoever you put into it. And, you know, over time, often that will be an analyst who wants to grow into something that's a little more data sciencey and experiment with some different methodologies. Sometimes it's not, and you're going to end up hiring into that role. But for me, like, the only success that I've had in this is setting those expectations up front. Like, I've worked with people who wanted to be doing more complex things, and the solution was for them to go somewhere else and do more complex things.
Yeah, I agree with that. I was going to say that my main solution has just been screening for that and hiring. Like, if someone immediately like jumps to using a deep learning model, it's like, this is a process of mutual selection, and I'm going to tell you right now that you won't like this job if that's what you're expecting to do. I manage data scientists, but not very many. My team is mostly analysts, because that's frankly more of what the company needs and more of what almost every company needs. It's very rare to need complex modeling. There's like some formulation that says machine learning is the high interest credit card of technical debt. If you invest really heavily in machine learning and you're not ready for it, you've just wasted a ton of time. And you probably also like did not properly set up a system with good observability or like tracking of your pipeline or your model versions or whatever. Over time, you're really going to regret having invested in something that is not very agile.
I'll add to that a bit more. So I'm Qasim. I've led data teams at a couple of different startups and just done a lot of random stuff. I pretty much agree exactly with you guys. I've had the pleasure, I guess, of inheriting data scientists before a couple of times. Usually it goes along the lines of VC tells CEO he needs a data team, he needs a data scientist. CEO hires a junior data scientist because they're cheaper than experienced data scientists. Finds out that junior data scientist is not the most helpful for the business. I get inserted in either voluntarily or they just paid me well enough that I considered it. And here I am. So, I mean, I think there is definitely agreed that most of the time it's difficult, if not impossible, to kind of like manage expectations of people who came in thinking that their life is just going to be a fast AI course, which isn't true. But there are like, I've had some success with getting data scientists to become like pivot a bit more heavy on analytics with the understanding that they might not be learning and focusing heavily on machine learning, but they're bringing in like optimizing again on business outcome and then showing them more like other ends of the technical skills that they might not have, be it like analytics, engineering, things like that, and making them a more rounded product like person overall.
Yeah, another good technique with that is when there is a situation where it might actually be appropriate to use something more advanced, like clustering is a very common one I find. If you have someone who wants to use a fancy technique, that's a good way to sate that curiosity to a certain extent. Like, you got to make sure to keep your eye on the ball and not let them go down a huge rabbit hole, but it is a good opportunity, at least, to let them flex some of their more technical interests.
Yeah, I completely agree. And also a big proponent of like 20% time type of situation where it's like, sure, you think that there's value in doing this over-engineered product, great, let's work on it.
So one thing that I'm sort of hearing here is that like, and this sort of happened in my experience. I'm gonna try to like weave together a couple of threads, both from this conversation and I think some other conversations that have happened. Is like it sounds like a lot of the managers of these data science teams are spending a lot of time doing what I would consider like what I would think about as being like product work, right? Like thinking about like, okay, what is the MVP? How are we actually adding value? How does this fit into the product? There have been some conversations, I think, about data product managers. And I think maybe y'all already had a coffee hour about this. I don't think I was able to be there for it. Like, I'm curious as to like how y'all think about that of like, cause like a lot of engineering managers like don't spend a lot of time doing that, like thinking about like, what is the MVP of this product? Like that's just not their job. But yet like everyone sort of on this call is sort of talking about that being like a large part of their job. Like, how do y'all think about that? How do y'all think about, you know, should we be having more data product managers who should be like really doing some of this work of thinking about like, you know, what is the MVP? How are we actually adding value? I don't know. I sort of wanted to raise that question as like a way potentially for us to think about as like a profession. Like, how do we sort of push this conversation forward? So it's not, so the roles, I guess, are a little bit better defined.
We haven't had that meetup yet. It's coming. I think it's in December. It took a while to schedule, but it's on the docket. Yeah, I mean, it is both one of the best and worst things about this job that when you lead a data team in a relatively small company, you are the product manager and you are the people manager, and you're usually still an individual contributor and you do all the things, which keeps it interesting, but it's very challenging to sort of be able to devote the time and attention to the craft of each one of those things independently. But you know, I think there's a little bit of a difference between sort of managing analytics as a product and managing data science as a product. And it's much easier, I think, to manage data science as a product because you can really focus on like, what's the output? What metrics are we moving with these changes? How do we know if it worked? And analytics is a little, impact is much less nebulous. Call it ROI or impact or whatever, but it's a lot harder to kind of wrap your head around.
It's a really good point.
I think that then that brings in the sort of philosophy of data as a service and data as a product. And so it's like, is data science the best served as a product and data analytics best served as a service? Hi, I'm Steven. I am the data analyst at TPublic, a small startup. I use the word "the" intentionally. We only have one data analyst and we have no data scientists, but we are hiring for all of those things right now. So thank goodness. Okay, that's it.
I've seen the data project manager to be really a core skill that we expect analysts to have, at least at the last 3 companies I've been at. Largely that separates, I think, analysts that do really well and analysts that end up just being a ticket taker. That's really where I've seen that line separate. So I consider myself really good at project managing large 3-month+ things as well as smaller ones. And that's where I try to help other analysts, or even our data science team is still mostly analyst with a little bit of data science mixed in, like you guys were mentioning earlier. But yeah, I consider that to be a core competency. Maybe at some point when you get a bigger company, it makes sense to have that go-between from the analyst to the business. But at least for us, we're 2,000 people at Smartsheet almost, so we're pretty sizable, and we still expect analysts like me to just be able to do it.
Yeah, I will say.
Go
ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Katie, you
staring
go.
contest. Okay.
You go, Katie.
I was going to say that I do find when I talk to people who are in analytics roles, like when you talk about like, oh, like what are directions you might want to take your career, product manager comes up a lot. They generally are more aligned with product and more interested in product, at least in my experience. And they often end up being sort of mini PMs. I've also found that when I've worked with data product manager type people, it usually ends up being for like a data platform or a data warehouse, an experiments framework, something like that. It's very rarely ever analysis is the product they're managing. Managing a bunch of analysts who do mostly related things, I do feel like I'm their PM sometimes. And like, I don't know what that exactly makes me the PM of, but maybe the PM of knowledge. But the like building the coherent like theory of how your company works, I think is a lot of times actually what you're trying to do across many people on an analytics team. So building that theory is maybe the thing that you're trying to steward and discover, like all of the flows through and that sort of thing. That's an ill-formed thought, but one that I've had recently, at least.
If you're curious, I was basically going to say the same thing around like, I think data product managers make more sense if it's like some bigger platform or product that the data team's delivering versus like one-off analyses. Like actually the concept of that kind of horrifies me, of like some product manager that's like intermediating between like the business and an analyst who's like supposed to be delivering that. Like to me, that's like the antithesis of what you want. Open to other perspectives. It's never made a lot of sense to me personally.
Yeah, I mean, have any of you worked in like an academic research lab? Because I feel like this role is almost like being the person who runs a research lab. Like you have a primary investigator who is maybe like guiding all the grad students towards a certain thing. It's not a perfect analogy, but I feel like some parts of that actually do apply well to analytics teams.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of think that there is a role there, especially on the more data science side. So on the analyst side, I agree with you, Barry, that like I wouldn't necessarily want someone intermediating between the analyst and the business stakeholder. I think once you get into more complex projects, that's where someone with a product manager mindset can actually start to add a lot of value. Thinking about, you know, if you're working with a data scientist and you're doing some, I don't know, churn prediction thing, it's like someone needs to be thinking about like, well, what are we going to do if we know who's predicted? How are we going to measure it? What's the 20% way of doing it? You know, these are projects that take months to do and potentially are coordinating among different teams. You've got the data scientists, you've got the software engineers, you've got some front-end person who's working on the intervention. You've got to work with the business. Are we going to use a coupon code? How do we set, like, there's just like a lot of work, both coordinating work to do there, as well as like product thinking, like how is this going to help our customers? And so that's where, like, I think that it's more on that side where I think a dedicated product person could start to add a lot of value. Or in Katie's example, where you have potentially like a very complicated like research endeavor, again, where you have multiple threads of people doing sort of very in-depth, complicated research work, and someone needs to be sort of thinking about like, how are we going to weave these threads together? That is another place where I think like having that sort of coordinator role can be valuable.
I think one thing that's interesting about that last idea is that like inherently to this creating models is like complexity. And that's like the opposite of what you want with like a lean approach, right? And so maybe lean and data science in a way are at odds with each other because of that, because like you guys have all said, the like data PM, data science, it only really becomes like real. You don't really realize the value at scale of the data, at the scale of the company, at the scale of the investment that you can put in those people. So I'm just wondering, is that something that's even possible, or are you just kind of adding some hackiness to data science? Is it inherently like a real thing, or is it something that you can do in a lean way?
So I want to take a first stab at this, but I'm curious to hear what other people have to say. I mean, my answer to that is that, like, you know, the idea behind lean is not to say no complexity. The idea behind lean is to say like as little complexity as possible until we know it's going to be valuable, right? And so that is where I think like those two things come together. Like software engineering can obviously be enormously complex, right? Like you can, you know, the whole idea behind the lean startup, right, is that, you know, you could come up with an idea and then hire 20 software engineers and go build the whole thing, and it would be like an enormously complex monster. And then the problem is that you put it in front of customers and like they don't want it, and you just wasted all of that time and money. And so I think that like when I think about lean and data science, it's sort of, again, sort of analogous to that, where it's like we have the potential for this thing to be very complex, right? But what is the minimum amount of that complexity that we can build that will allow us to get value to our customers? And so that's how I start to think about, you know, sort of tying those two concepts together.
Yeah, I would say in some ways analytics is inherently more scientific. That sounds crazy, but it's something where you're going in saying that you don't know what the problem is per se. You're going to find out by looking at the data. It's something that is inherently more iterative. It's something that inherently requires some humility, because you're willing to admit that maybe your idea of what's going on is not actually what's going on. And when analytics is pegged to experimentation, which hopefully it is, that also just makes it a lot more iterative and scientific. It's just actually trying to discover the problem, which is a really important part of a product workflow, but maybe one that doesn't get talked enough about analytics because everyone's really focused on ticketing and SQL monkeys and that sort of thing.
To that point, it feels like one just idea for leaning up the data science thing is just like, I love the idea in lean startup of the kind of like Wizard of Oz idea where it's like, it's intermediated by a person delivering a result, which actually, funny enough, sounds exactly like what an analyst does. So it's like you can kind of cut out that whole delivery of your model into the product and maybe just find out a way to have the same leverage on the product without building it in, and maybe just having people say like, these are the 3 A/B tests that we can do that would be informed by this model, and then let that be the kind of the leaner thing, because it seems like the cost of data science is primarily the infrastructure and getting it in, but then also the huge cycle times you get. So at least you can cut out the infrastructure part of that in delivering.
I do think that a lot of it goes back to what I think Vijay was saying in that thread, which is like, what is data your part of your core product, or is it more of like a quote unquote nice to have? So like, if I think like when data is your core product, that's when a lot more like, I think that kind of goes back to what you were saying, where like you most likely will need a data product manager because data is your product. Versus like if it's more or less like nice to have ancillary asks, it goes into a point of like, at what point it's like, like how much do you like how nice is your nice to have compared to everything else? Does that make sense?
Yeah, the idea of data being core to the product is an interesting one in this conversation as well. Like there are some businesses that it needs machine learning to work, but the vast majority of them don't. And maybe they'll eventually need a data scientist to do the machine learning part of it once they're very mature. But in almost every scenario, you're probably going to get by with just analytics.
Yeah, we had just analytics at Smartsheet, and then machine learning people were hired on the software team. Like we don't even see them on our BI team. They were just hired directly into software engineering, and they're just not even part of our crew.
I guess one of the things that's happening at my company is that something very similar to that, where the data engineers and also a data scientist is being hired more on the sort of development side, search side of things, and analytics is starting to become sort of its own thing. I've been doing a lot of reading on different structures, and I wonder how other companies are sort of similarly set up or differently set up. Are they data scientists sort of pulled in the direction of the engineering end of things and less onto the analytics end of things? How does that work in other people's companies?
In my experience, it depends a lot. It often depends on kind of the structure quite early on in the company and like who is in the CTO, head of engineering seat, and whether they want this thing. I worked in places where you've got machine learning that really lives in engineering. That often makes sense when it's a core part of the product, and major functionality depends on it. I've also worked in places where the engineering team did not have machine learning as a core competency, didn't really want to build that, and then it sort of evolved out of analytics, which is an interesting place to be because you get to be a little bit more of a skunk works and like actually do things in a very lean way. And there are different ways to kind of handle the trade-off on infrastructure investments, and that's a lot of what we were kind of talking about in that thread, is like how much do you invest in up front when it's in an engineering workflow that tends to happen a little bit earlier. If you're going to build it right. Whereas if it's not built into the product, necessarily a sort of a core component. You're not going to bring down the site when your model isn't super performant. Then you've got a little more room to experiment and do things in a very lean way and slowly kind of build up to that and prove out the value before you build it in to the product, which I find to be a better route. But I think it largely depends on like really how core is this to the business. Are you testing something that could be an interesting addition to the product, or are you testing something that like your product isn't going to work if you can't do this thing?
Yeah, I also find that there are certain types of teams or like different, I don't know what word I want to use exactly for this, but like I find that teams that are very focused on like ads performance, data scientists in those teams get very quickly pulled towards engineering because it's something that is just so quantitative and so central to the effectiveness of the business. Growth also, I find, ends up being quite quantitative in that way. And then when you start getting into general consumer product stuff, data science and machine learning are generally not as helpful. You'll have stuff like churn modeling that might be applied in there, but that's usually like a pretty secondary thing compared to all of the more immediate product analytics needs, at least in my experience.
Katie, I think that's right. I think the interesting like counterexample is something like Stitch Fix, right? Where, you know, it's like obviously a very consumer focused company, but then they have this whole idea of like the whole way that we're going to do what we do is by building us on the background of, or building us on the sort of on the backbone of these data science products. And so I guess like a question that I ponder and I have no answer to at all is like, is Stitch Fix the future? And so like all like, you know, all of these sort of consumer companies today that are working the way that they're working now need to be doing data science in order to be able to sort of keep up, because that's what the future of delivering consumer products is going to look like. Or are they like, you know, just like this crazy, this, you know, this one-off example that happened to work because that's the way that it works and everyone else will sort of continue as they are. I don't have an answer there, but like, that's a thing that I ponder a little bit is like, is that the future? And so we all need to be sort of like thinking about this and how we're going to do it, or is that just like a different thing altogether than like a normal consumer product company?
I feel like it is. The core to their business is the relevance of the recommendations of what you put into your, what do they call they call the boxes fixes, I think. Like machine learning is the business, the algorithm is the business there. Like there is other parts of it that, like, I mean, like, from what I know about Stitch Fix, they have like an entire like warehouse optimization team and stuff too. So they've gotten quite deep in other ways, but the actual like giving people clothes thing, I don't think would work at least nearly as well if it was just paying designers or stylists to select the things. Yeah, so like it is a consumer product, but I feel like it's a different sort of consumer product.
I think about this a lot. I realized I never introduced myself.
I'm hesitating the right way to pronounce. My wife works at Stitch Fix, so I hear quite a bit about this. And the one thing I'll say that I think is neat is she's not on the data team, but she's in a pretty analytical role. And she talks a lot about our algo partners. And I feel like I know some of their names now of like these people on the algos team, which is like what they call data science, that she spends a lot of time like iterating on stuff with. And I think they're an interesting model where like they've clearly found a way to have that, no pun intended, woven very in the fabric of their, I think, isn't their blog is called multi-threaded? I don't know, there was some pun to be had in there. But it's woven very closely in where like it's, I actually like wanted to talk to her about this a bunch of like the way that partnership materializes and how they partner and work together. And to me, that's always felt like the ideal. So like, but you're talking about something a little bit different, Michael, which is like, do you build a business like fundamentally like on data science? I think actually like it kind of shows that Eric Colson, who was the first data science leader at Stitch Fix, came from Netflix, because it's like a very, if you kind of back up and blow your eyes a little bit, it's actually very similar. It's like, we're going to recommend a bunch of stuff to you algorithmically, and that's how we're going to make sense of this big inventory we have. I think there's a lot of businesses that are going to look that way. There's a lot of businesses that won't, but like, to me, the way that most data science is most effective is that like close partnership of like, what are we actually trying to achieve? You have like algorithms, people at Stitch Fix who like spend their time with stylists, like looking at outfits together. Like that feels like the ideal, much more than like an R&D team socked away somewhere.
Yeah, I actually think
I probably just said a bunch of proprietary information about Stitch Fix. I'm gonna get sued or something now, but all right.
Your wife will get sued, not you.
Don't tell my wife.
Sorry, Caitlin.
No, it's fine. I think there's kind of two paths. Like there are just such better recommendation products coming out on the market. I think if it's not your core competency, it's really easy to buy it to the extent that recommendation is just a marginal benefit for your business. But there are a lot of businesses that are built on sort of this new unlock that like you can effectively recommend something to a very specific individual based on your specific knowledge of their behavior and kind of what they want. And there's a lot of value to be had on that. And you know, I never introduced myself. I'm Caitlin. I work for Trove Recommerce. We do resale. We run resale platforms for large brands like REI and Patagonia. So like our core data science problem is how do you price 30 years of REI catalogs? Like every item that REI has sold over the past 30 years, like what's their price today? And you can't effectively do that. I mean, we can make up rules, but there's a lot of misses in those rules if you just say, you know, whatever, it's X% of MSRP. And what does that even mean when you're basing it on like a 1990s MSRP? How do you capture inflation and age and desirability of the item the first time and like the color and whatever, the fact that nobody is an extra small and whatever, all the things. And so there's, you know, there are problems where you have to solve it yourself. And there are a lot of problems now that you can just solve off the shelf that I think that is a core piece of many businesses going forward.
One last question that I had from earlier in the conversation, qasim, am I saying that correctly?
Yeah, qasim.
You had said, you know, that like a lot of the founders will hire like a junior data scientist instead of a senior data scientist, and you have to come in and like tell them that they're not doing their job very well or whatever. I'm sort of curious, like, what's your perspective on like, what is the difference between a junior data scientist and a senior data scientist? Like when, like, if those founders had hired someone who you thought was like actually good, what would that person be doing instead, or what would that look like?
So I think that honestly, the way I define, I guess, junior versus senior isn't too different than the way you've written on lean data science to a certain extent. To the fact that like a junior data scientist will look at, I think, what is the most academically elegant solution or like engineering elegant solution as opposed to what like gets like derives the most business value. And I think that that's kind of the biggest distinction in my head. Like someone who kind of knows how to deliver results when they need to get results, and like when to pull out which tool is part of it. Also, like, yes, there's a whole investment in infrastructure. Someone who like, if you can't invest in infrastructure and you're the only data hire at a company, there are going to be problems long term, but that's a whole separate conversation.
Yeah, there is a certain degree to which seniority is related to mastery of your tool set, but really I feel like the biggest differentiator is just knowing how to operate without supervision, being able to have a broad scope. That's the main thing that makes someone senior in my book, and that's true for analysts or data scientists.
I don't have anything else. We've got 5 minutes. I don't know if anyone has like a one last question or idea that they want to throw out. But otherwise, I think this has been a really fun conversation. So thanks y'all for joining. It's been great. All right, I think we're ending 5 minutes early. Y'all have time for a bio break before your next meeting. Go grab that coffee, crack open a Diet Coke. This was really fun. Thank y'all so much. I really appreciate it. I'm always around if anyone ever wants to chat about any of this stuff. So you can either hit me up on Slack or send me an email or whatever. But really fun stuff. Thank y'all so much.